morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today, and we've got a guest with us for our first big story right off the bat. So let's get right to it, I say.
That's right. It has been a no good, terrible, and very bad week for Joe Biden when it comes to Israel. It began on Monday night when news trickled out that the Israeli army targeted World Central Kitchen aid workers and, in a series of 3 separate strikes, killed 7 of them, including an American citizen, who were in Gaza distributing food. The anger and fury about this action, which celebrity chef and founder Jose Andres called intentional, has mounted. Andres is publicly refuting Israel's explanation and saying that his staff was targeted, full stop. Now, an international storm is brewing. Even some UK lawmakers are questioning its policies of supplying arms to Israel.
On Tuesday, Biden welcomed a small group of Muslim community leaders to the White House for an iftar dinner, the traditional feast for breaking the daily fast for Ramadan. They met, but at least one man walked out before the food and the meal was canceled. A Palestinian-American doctor from Chicago who'd recently been to Gaza presented Biden a video from an orphaned 8-year-old girl pleading for the U.S. to do something. One doctor told NBC News that when she showed Biden these photos she'd personally taken on her phone of malnourished children and women in Gaza. Biden responded to that he'd seen the photos before, which of course was not possible since she had just taken those photos personally. Then in Wisconsin, primary voters voiced their opposition to Biden's Israel policies by logging nearly double the anticipated uncommitted votes, coming in at nearly 50,000. While the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been angry at Biden for its perceived unwavering support for Israel, now even his supporters and former colleagues are chastising the president. Former Obama speechwriter, popular podcaster Jon Favreau took a public swipe, posting on Twitter, "The president doesn't get credit for being privately enraged when he still refuses to use leverage to stop the IDF from killing and starving innocent people," Favreau wrote on social media. And on the other side of the establishment aisle, former Condoleezza Rice advisor, National Security Council spokesperson Elise Jordan even criticized Biden's unwillingness to condition aid to Israel. So is this an inflection point? With us is the Hill's White House opinion editor, Niall Stanage. Niall, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
So you had a kind of viral moment the other day asking questions of the administration about what's going on. Can you talk to us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was an exchange in the White House briefing room with John Kirby. And really the question or the questions had only really 2 purposes. One being, to ask whether the White House had any intention of conditioning aid to Israel in the wake of these events. And the second one really getting at the point that the White House, in fact, the president himself issued a memo in February that was positing that there should be conditions, that American military aid should not be given to any nation that infringes upon human rights or runs against international humanitarian law. It seemed to me on its face that the killing of those aid workers did that. But Mr. Kirby disagreed, as is his right.
Yeah, what's become revealed by the extraordinary questioning that you and your colleagues have been doing is that the response from the White House is pat, regardless of the escalation, it seems, of the kinds of, I'm just going to call them crimes that are happening. And the response, generally speaking, and correct me if you see this differently, seems to be that Israel is going to do an investigation of itself, and that investigation is a kind of a stand-in in the eyes of the administration for actual accountability. Prim Tucker, who's been a recent guest on this show as well, who's a journalist over at The Intercept, asked a question about that, I believe just yesterday or the day before, pointing out that Shireen Abu Akleh, an American-Palestinian journalist who was killed by an IDF sniper 2 years ago, had a similar pattern where at first they said they denied responsibility, blamed it on Palestinian gunfire, later said they were doing an investigation, and only under the pressure of the international community eventually conceded that it may have been an Israeli sniper. But that didn't actually manifest in any criminal responsibility for the person involved or any substantive policy change for how Israel conducts itself. Is that how you're seeing the tenor of the responses coming out of the White House?
I think there is a certain pattern or template to the responses, Bree, at this stage. And I think that is a real problem given the escalation or the repetition of these kinds of events. The shooting of the journalist that you mentioned obviously was, caused a lot of outrage when that happened. But even more recently, we had, of course, the firing upon the crowd of people who were looking for food a relatively short time ago. And that followed the same kind of pattern that you were referring to. These expressions of outrage from the White House, but very little in terms of real action and a suggestion that an Israeli investigation of these events will be sufficient. I think that's actually increasingly out of step with popular opinion, certainly left of centre. And when you have a situation where the Israelis have now shot people looking for food and bombed people delivering food, and the White House maintains this template that you refer to, it's not hard to understand why that is causing increasing anger, I think, particularly among people who are broadly sympathetic to the Palestinians.
Right. So there's at least some awareness, obviously, among the Biden administration and, frankly, even among the Israeli government, that this incident is going to cause more vocal frustration, is more galling, cannot be written off. Jose Andres obviously talking about how his group had permission to operate here, has had a pre-existing relationship with the IDF, was cleared to be distributing food here in a truck that was clearly marked, should have been obvious to the drone camera. Very upset about it. Netanyahu, issuing an apology saying there's going to be an investigation. But now all this pressure. So is this going to be a turning point where people start saying, your line, Joe Biden, that we're going to support Israel no matter what, continue to send weapons no matter what, and just kind of maybe privately gripe about what's going on? Is that going to satisfy the American people?
I think we have to see whether that pattern that we've just been talking about is broken by these events. Does it change this sort of rote response of condemnation without action, or is there an actual shift in American policy? Now, two things I would say on that. Obviously, there's the meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. We'll see what emerges there. But the other point, Robbie, is that we are, to your point, seeing criticism of Israel, and not just criticism, but a desire for a policy change spread out from people who were clearly on the left of the Democratic Party to a much more centrist or moderate position. I mean, Senator Chris Coons, for example, is no one's idea of some sort of left-wing radical. And, I see he has increasingly positioned himself toward the fact that military aid should have conditions attached. So is this something that is a pivotal moment? We'll see, but I think certainly pressure is building more and more for that kind of a change.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, we referenced the Condoleezza Rice, former advisor, who's on MSNBC saying, why isn't Biden conditioning aid? You have the Pod Save America guys who are former Obama, Biden White House speechwriters saying this is making you look weak to say constantly that you're upset but aren't able to, or willing rather, to use your leverage and actually condition aid in any way. And even Jose Andres himself was someone who, in the not so recent past, was arguing with people and criticizing people who were critical of Israel, accusing Israel of having indiscriminate bombing campaigns and the like, being very defensive of the Israeli government. Now, of course, on the other side of it, now that 7 of his employees have been killed in this attack, which is difficult to describe as anything other than targeted, given the nature of it. I want to ask you briefly about this Iftar situation, too, because it's not just the kind of bigger policy question of why won't he condition aid. That is the big ticket item, and that is what your question went to, and I think why it went so viral. But there's also this question of, is he even able to manage public perception as an empathetic guy, this brand that he's been leaning so heavily on, if during an iftar dinner, he's telling people who are trying to show him, implore him, put in his face the gravity of the tragedy that they've seen firsthand, and he's telling them, I've already seen that? Is that seems like it's coming off as either a kind of kind of cognitive frailty of, does he not remember which pictures he's seen or not? Or perhaps even worse, a kind of venal indifference to the suffering he's being shown. What do you make of that?
I think the danger of it being taken as a demonstration of indifference is very, very serious for the reason that you mentioned, Bree, that this idea of empathy is so central to Biden. Just very briefly, I'm going to draw on my Belfast roots for a second, because there we're still dealing with the legacy of a conflict. And there's a phrase, the hierarchy of victims, suggesting that there are certain victims that seem to matter more to officialdom, let's say, than others. I think that is a real danger here for President Biden if the perception grows even more widespread that either Palestinian lives or people who are aiding the Palestinians are lower in that hierarchy of victims. That's a danger.
Sorry, and just to that point, of course, in New York Magazine yesterday or the day before, there was that report of someone close to the president who argued exactly that he was asked, do you think there is a hierarchy of victims? Do you think that Biden has the same affection for Palestinians as he does Israeli or Jewish victims? And the answer was no, of course not. Sorry, Robbie.
Yeah, no worries. One more thing I wanted to ask you about, Niall, is actually the Donald Trump side of this. There's been reporting in The Hill and other places, and I'm just seeing that he talked to Hugh Hewitt, a conservative radio host, who asked him, Hugh Hewitt asked Trump, do you still stand with Israel 100%? And Trump was a little bit evasive on that and frankly said that he thinks Israel is losing the PR war. He says, they got to finish it. They got to finish what they started. They should finish it fast. And you can read that in an ambiguous way. But the way some people, including very hardline pro-Israel people, are reading it is that Donald Trump is actually not as committed to this, or perhaps if he was in charge, wouldn't be as committed to this as Joe Biden has been. Can you parse that a little bit?
I think the interesting thing about the Trump remarks, including with Hugh Hewitt, is that they tend to address, frankly, the TV footage that is emerging from this conflict. So, look, I don't think there's really any question that former President Trump is instinctively more pro-Israel than President Biden or anyone in the Democratic Party, basically. But I do think that Trump sees how badly the war is going from an Israeli perspective in terms of undermining support and sympathy for the Israelis, because the suffering that is being inflicted is just so undeniable.
Niall Stanage, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.